Yakitomy. Try Yakitomy with no ads. Philosophical reflection. Some of my metaphysical axioms and semantics. Mental states should be a term that characterizes a particular desire in such a way to express and refer to what this desire aims for. Any why. Power is a desire that seeks to gain advantage to its ego. Therefore this metaphysical image I wish you hold on to while we discuss this is that of the world being composed of physical phenomena, which are namely those beta-mode sensations to the perceptive/physic being that feels and thinks and considers. So the physical world operates with a bunch of egos, each of them asleep to and forgotten of each other, as they are really an inseparable phenomenon that fundamentally and physically depends on the world outside them, including other egos, and as such constitutes a world as a grand mind, who's playing this game of pretending it doesn't know itself at each and every layer of where on location of it. An ego sees itself as distinct from the world outside it. By contrast, the world inside the so-called ego, or ego illusion, or the world dreaming on a particular area of itself at a particular time of itself, so the world inside this ego is the eternally abstract world that is utilized as the nourishing resource of knowledge to form some identity of our situation of birth and our coming situation of death. So let's be clear on my use of their terms: the physical world and the spiritual world, and the mind and the nature of abstractions, and the ego and the Brahman. The physical world, as I already mentioned above, is the world of perception, and the reference of those synthetic facts from science that is built from the accumulation of finding patterns/laws of the way the world outside the ego works. The spiritual world is exactly the same, as I use the term, as the ordinary physical world. However, it is only realized by the ego once the ego stops seeking and searching at a given moment in the day. For instance, I am in my car driving and I am passively observing the street lights and the cars and drivers and passengers in front of me, with the radio off and the windows down for the fresh breeze. As I am getting where I need to go, my mind may reach a moment where it stops worrying, to whatever degree of this anxious mental state, about the things that occupy my mind. Once I relax out of it, and find my center, that is, given to those areas of tension across my body that pulsate varying pockets of strains and stress, I relax out of these strains and tensions by commanding my attention and concentration over their presence on the spatial location and volumetric approximation of where I subjectively its effects. That is to say, most specifically, as to call into practice right now. Stop what you are doing and focus. Really concentrate on your left finger. Concentrate for a moment now. Concentrate away from that finger and onto your right foot big toe. Concentrate for a moment. Suppose there was a strain/a tickle or a pain here. The idea is to concentrate head onto it instead of trying to hide from it in defense mode by attempting to concentrate away from it. It's like trying to avoid the tickle sensation without scratching. Very difficult indeed if you're trying to focus on a different area, though possible, but then it returns with a vengeance, usually. In other words, Yoga Nitra can take you into the world of the spiritual aspects of your daily encounters with the physical world. Once I relax out of the anxieties of the present moment, you find yourself at peace in the spiritual part of world that underlies the physical world in its state of encounter with anxieties that infiltrate the present ego. To summarize now, the ego uses the mind as a tool to acquire whatever it is the mental states of the mind desire from the anxious physical world, but simultaneously at any moment can learn to let go of the tensions brought by these unattainable desires, and thereby silences these desires. Such a new mental state is then said to be in contact with the spiritual aspect of physical world. We get into this spirituality every night, when we in fact rest a good night's sleep, or doze into a daydream or a fit of rest that attacks you at work, when you are expected by everyone to be awake and energized and anxious to a balanced degree. Since anxiety to some degree is sought in the social affairs, to liven things up a bit, this can be seen as a healthy kind of anxiety that flows naturally, so long as you stay true to being in total readiness and spontaneity for the next thing that will be encountered, instead of constantly planning. By trying to plan where the attack is coming from, you waste energy anticipating where you ought to defend. If you are to be struck, let yourself be struck and then attack, instead of hopelessly worrying. If you are trying to anticipate the direction of an attack, or the punchline of a joke, then you will be preoccupied by trying to anticipate, and therefore not be ready for the blow, and likewise you won't find the joke funny, because you were looking for that punchline and found it, when you should have allowed it to surprise you. So spiritual realization is important, and fun and interesting to realize, but once you've gotten hold of the relaxation and peaceful zen of it all, you should try to force yourself there, when the next moment calls for you to have some level of anxiety. In other words, fear's a time to rest, and there's a time to play. I shall now explain my use of the term/expression mind, and the nature of abstract entities, respectively. I use the term mind to only represent the phenomena that is associated with all that goes with living from the subjective point of view of the organism ego that thinks, imagines, feels, perceives, reasons, considers, determines, believes, demands, and shakes hands in agreement with those like itself. So a mind is then that phenomenon that is like, and is the process of all the possible mental states of the human organism, and every other organism with mental features that degrade across the lower orders of evolution along this tracking of complex human consciousness. The term mind, as used, can refer then to the operations, or the phenomenology of an ego distinguished from another ego by position of space and time, located always in the here and now. The interesting thing about the mind then is that each ego can relate to other egos, in that they share in common emotions, like rage and jealous, and fear, and lust. These mental states, or emotions, are then projected into a collected public dialogue that transforms each ego's expressions of who they are, as seen by what they do in these desire-filled mental states, into abstractions that are formally known today as political and economic ideologies, that once refined to a point of status quo and social agreement, become popularized ideas with propaganda for membership, or for acting together for the purpose of some cause to be done, or to be punished, or to be treated as seen fit. The group mind can then be situated in these political and economic ideologies that are only of abstract nature, that is to say, extensions of the concrete areas from which they inflated from. At that level of original concreteness, the mind of the ego is understood individually to each ego as the more primal layer of importance, and the latter abstractions that extend from here upon agreements through collective social bargaining constitutes the mirror image of the ego's concrete mind to the sight of itself as the group mind in abstraction. A history of political disagreement, I would say, rests here in the conflict of knowing where to place importance. Shall I place the importance on the group mind or the individual? Which way will lead to the best prosperous future system of organization? Communism, capitalism, socialism, the libertarian ideas of the minimalist state, the anarcho-capitalist position of no state, or perhaps the Zeitgeist and Venus Project's position of seeing the present ills of the system of agreements as power and sourcing the problem outside of the state, and into the individuals who compose the state, and further into the values system and hence rules of behavior that govern the very structures that compose violence and coercion actually. Finally, I shall explain to you the difference between the ego and the Brahman. The ego is the mind that sleeps itself into a dream, that amplifying in drama once born into a world that carries with it traditions that sweep you into early beliefs and practices of living. We call this cultural programming. But each mind, we can realize, is a concrete reflection of the abstract ideologies taken as whole. that is, take every possible and actual kind of logical fork that creates public ideologies and popular notions, or popular and formalized ways of doing things. Taking this set of possible and historically actual doings, and this is what is meant by the group mind, or the many personalities of the unrestricted concrete mind of a particular ego individual. We are all capable of understanding what the other does. In fact, we find each other interesting to the extent we've understood and guessed correctly what the other is or was actually doing in some instant. But we always have free choice, and hence can realize now that at any moment you can become the Republican or the Democrat, the social liberal or the social conservative, or the Marxist or the Austrian or Keynesian. We can all potentially develop the thoughts and manifest the spirit and feelings of advocacy or disagreement, in which case we can reason justifiably that this capability for an ego by choice of his own or accident can become another way of thinking, constitutes the basis for why we are all expression of the same thing, that chose to uniquely take up a different area, and through your life you may mature into a new way of thinking with a different set of ways. And so we can establish so far that there is a grand mind, that we all partake by conscious choice or accidental conditioning. The Brahman then is just the group mind. But this group mind is only realized in this argument as a human species kind of grand organism. However, the same is true with the physical world around each ego. Each ego is a concrete mind that has a social and physical nature. We've so far discussed the concrete social nature and how it projects into an abstract group nature when conceptually and with reason and the dialectical process in each of our ego's concrete minds. And lastly, we've reasoned that a metaphysical organism constitutes from the collective individual concrete minds of the human race. So each individual ego concrete mind has the capacity to become the potential mind of another, or another that exists only in potential, that has already historically manifested in someone other. Therefore all the potentialities, actual and possible, are the grand mind together, and this notion can be thought in removed in abstraction, or intimately in concreteness to an extent that can extend further by way of practice/technique of spiritual enlightenment, or by a medium/tool of a substance like LSD. Either way, an extension of the body can be accomplished using either method. The latter is more of a guarantee than the former as presently evidenced. Now I must finally turn to you, not only being the same way of thoughts and thought pattern of others, but also those individuals' sensational bodies and their experience qualia, and furthermore the bodies that lay beyond those individual bodies, and their qualia agu. You are also the so-called external world. Say so-called external world, because it is often believed in modern culture that the ego and the world are ultimately separate. That is, the ego and its bodily formed materials like the hearts, and the organs and their smaller constituency are all actually inseparable. This matter of which constitutes my body and yours, is the same matter that governs the objects adjacent to them, and all this matter is thought to consist in space, which is to say adhere in something separate, which is to say, the matter and the space are separate, and therefore everything in space is separate to the extent there is space around the matter that differentiates it from other pieces of matter. The truth, however, is that space and matter are polarities that originate in unity, and hence that objects don't cohere in, or consist in some substratum wherein separate things exist in the world. Instead, only one thing exists and its space at one end, matter on the other, and this proposition I place before you is the very reason why things don't actually exist. It's instead more precise to say only one thing exists, and that is every supposed thing taken as one. In philosophy, this view I advocate is against this materialism views that cling onto this notion of a substratum or principle of separability, or existence of thinghood. The term for this metaphysical position is called monism as it applied to beings, and now I shall continue its position, that things too are all only belong to one thing, That is only possible because of one undifferentiated thinking from the grandest mind of which we all partake, and are as an expression of the whole, in just the same way that the beach wave is the movement of the whole ocean. The ego's concrete mind, manifesting as David Mireles, is an expression of the total mind, of which I am the particular expression representing the piece, and hence the whole, since there really is no such thing pieces. In social sciences we learn about human behavior, and patterns of socializing starting from an alpha point of synthesizing concepts in alpha mode and beta mode. By contrast, in science, we learn about the physical world. We start from the beta mode point as individuals having perceptions, that are the metrics by which we extend our curiosities into the nature of sight, sound, sensations of heavy and light, and sensations of hard and soft, and still other sensations as tickles, itches, pains, pleasures, tensions, temperatures. From these perceptions and sensations we extend into finer concepts for which we can no longer perceive without use of instrumentation as microscopes and telescopes, to see the smaller and larger scales of the phenomena taken face value to the immediate perceptions. We then extrapolate into the past for a picture of the history of any particular phenomena, albeit human or cultural, or even species, ecosystem, or environment. Similarly, we look into the future and project depictions, albeit art depictions or scientific models of likelihood. But in these extensions, extrapolated into the past, present or future, we use the perceptions of the individual as the starting point, and the guiding metric for relevance of importance in the pattern phenomena in question. When the UFO sighting began, many intellectuals and scholars were forced to categorize the phenomenon. The same is important when defining the nature of what God is, or the nature of you, or anything in this world is. Therefore, the mind must always be put in this situation of how shall I categorize this phenomenon? When new information is considered, science helps to be a uniform cursor and metric in this way, showing that only phenomena-backed methods for which are ultimately relevant to the senses are those phenomena that can be learned by recourse to the senses, and this method of reason, in this way science is an instrument for human egos to extend their knowledge of their physical self, and see that they and the environment depends on each other in variant ways. Brought to you by Yakutami, Voice of the Web.